Hello and welcome to another bonus instalment of Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure game books out loud on the internet. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this episode we're taking a look at a very special book, A Day in the Life, written by my own dear husband as a birthday present for me on the occasion of my 45th birthday. As with his previous game book, The Cruel Game, my husband has graciously agreed that I can make this available to all my patrons. If you're listening to this and you're a patron, you can download this book right now from the pinned post over on patreon.com/HJDoom. If you want to get a copy and you aren't a patron yet, you can support me for as little as a single English pound and get a copy of A Day in the Life along with The Cruel Game and the 3 game books and 3 experimental role-playing games that I've written. That sounds like a bargain to me. You can, if you want, join for £1, download all of the stuff, and then cancel your membership. That's fine. If you're short of cash, I've no problem with that. My thanks as always go to those who already support me. This podcast is only possible because of your largesse. Now, we've seen game books that have as players bounty hunters, barbarian warriors, ordinary people and superheroes. A Day in the Life sets us a unique challenge to play out a day in the life of a domestic cat. Cats are, I think we could all agree, awesome. Our cat lives a life of pampered bliss such as most kings and queens of antiquity could only dream of, his every physical need attended to by solicitous servants, kept safe from danger, and provided with boundless love and companionship. This only makes it funnier that he's an angry and stressy little creature, constantly paranoid about where his next meal is coming from, and filled with a bottomless rage whenever he so much as glimpses another cat through the window, or a bird, or anything. He's like a tech billionaire, completely insulated from any negative consequences, yet somehow still aggrieved and always wanting more. I love him with a fierce and stupid love, as I have loved every cat in my life. I really like the idea of a game book devoted to a domestic cat, and I'm delighted to be able to present a playthrough of A Day in the Life. This will be a slightly shorter episode than usual, I suspect, because I want to avoid spoiling too much of the book for those that are going to read it, and partly because when I offer my closing remarks, I can't pretend I'm going to be anything approaching objective about it. It's impossible to be objective about a book that was written specifically for me by someone I love, and it would be pointless to pretend otherwise. Still, I'm sure there'll be some interesting ideas that it sparks and some interesting possibilities for discussion. So, let's take a look at the rules. As a domestic cat, we have 3 stats. The first is contentment, which is a measure of how happy we are. It begins at 12 and has no upper limit. Should contentment ever fall to 0, we give up on the day and go off to sulk until tomorrow, which ends our current adventure and is a thing I can absolutely get behind. There's no chance of dying in this book, and if there were, I probably wouldn't play it because I have a boundless reservoir of sentimentality when it comes to cats, even pretend cats. Our second stat is ferocity, which is used for fighting but also for animal stuff like balancing and jumping. You generate your ferocity by rolling 1d6 and adding 6. The text notes that a high ferocity may not always be good, as aggression will not always be the best solution, something my own cat would definitely dispute. Ferocity is used for fights which play out like fighting fantasy fights with an opposed roll of 2d6 plus ferocity to determine who wins each round, re-rolling any draws. There's a neat wrinkle here that all fights are a best of 3 roll, with the first side to win 2 combat rounds emerging the winner. This is a fun riff on an established system which creates a degree of design space by allowing for bespoke outcomes for losing each fight beyond simply dying. And I think it's appropriate for a game book with deliberately low stakes like this one. The final stat is luck, which functions like luck in fighting fantasy, but with the twist that all cats are naturally lucky, so you generate your luck by rolling 1d6 and adding 7 rather than 6. You can use your luck in fights much like in fighting fantasy, and you can test your luck at various points as well, with the usual loss of a point of luck for doing so. If you lose a combat roll during a fight, you can test your luck, and if you pass, you win instead of losing. So if you've already won one combat round and you've got a high luck, you can use it to automatically win the second round and thus win the whole fight. This makes luck much more impactful in combat than in Fighting Fantasy, which makes it a more tempting system to actually use. In Fighting Fantasy, I generally only use luck rarely, usually when I'm about to die if I don't. It'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. I have generated my cat, who I have decided to call Rear Admiral Clarence von Howitzer, because that sounds like a suitably feline name to me. They have a contentment of 12, a ferocity of 12, and a luck of 10. Let's play A Day in the Life. 1. Dawn's rosy fingers pry open the curtains and gently stroke your fur. Curled, cosy and comfy in your bed, you luxuriate in the sensation of sunlight on your flanks, purring without opening your eyes. There's no need to get up just yet. Perhaps you'll lie here all day. What was that pleasant vision you were absorbed in moments ago? Something about discovering a nest full of squeaking baby mice? The warmth creeps further along your back and ambient yellow light starts to seep through your eyelids, driving away dream. Early birds call outside the window, no doubt getting the worm. Your ears prick and swivel, and a faint excitement stirs in your stomach. Your empty stomach. If only it were filled with bird. Suddenly you realise you can't lie here all day. There are things to be done, food to be eaten, territory to be defended. Leaping to your paws, you stretch the stiffness out of your spine and give your face a quick wash. Ready for action, you take in your surroundings. A tall window stands a couple of feet to your right, curtains almost drawn but leaving a chink through which a sunbeam enters to illuminate your soft cushioned bed, itself resting on a chest of drawers. Various small items are scattered across the surface beside you, one emanating an intriguing odour. Elsewhere in the room are several other pieces of furniture which could benefit from further investigation, including a large human bed. You don't think you can smell a human in it, but one might be hiding there nonetheless. A door stands ajar opposite the window. How will you begin your morning? Would you like to jump onto the window ledge to keep an eye on the birds outside? Do you want to take a closer look at the objects on the chest of drawers? Or perhaps examine the other raised surfaces in the room, or search for humans in the large bed who might give you breakfast? Or you could just leave the room straight away and explore the hallway beyond. So, we open with 5 possible choices. Well, I think I'm going to start in my most immediate surroundings by looking at the objects on the chest of drawers. There are a range of items on top of the chest of drawer beside you. A prickly object which smells faintly of one of the local humans and contains some of her fur caught between its prickles. A small, cylindrical, shiny object which looks like it might roll well. A large, flat, oval thing propped up next to the wall. And most interestingly of all, a hard, cold, sparkly item with an intense, alluring scent. So, which do we want to investigate? Well, I think we've got a hairbrush, maybe some lipstick, a mirror. I don't know what the hard, cold, sparkly item with an intense and alluring scent is. So that's the one I'm going to investigate, the one with a strong smell. The sparkly little object is definitely the most interesting thing on the chest of drawers. The morning light twinkles on its myriad tiny facets as you approach and sniff it closely. Its scent is rich, pungent, indescribably strange. When you pat it tentatively with a paw, your claw tip catches it and makes it ring with a high-pitched note. How delightful! You play with it for some time, rolling it to and fro on the shiny surface and leaping ahead to intercept it. Gradually, your excitement grows and your swipes become increasingly violent. So I think this is actually a perfume bottle of some kind. Am I going to smash the perfume bottle? On the one hand, I hope not. On the other hand, I hope so. 8. I am lucky with my luck of 10. My luck now reduced to 9. One of your wilder paw swipes sends a little object flying right off the surface of the chest of drawers, bounces on the thick carpet a couple of times, then escapes under the big human bed. You hesitate, confused for a moment, before jumping down to look for your prey. Unfortunately, the gap beneath the bed is just too small for you to pursue the shiny thing. It has eluded you, for now. Never mind. You had already had a lot of fun from playing with it, and you are starting to feel noticeably hungry in any case. Gain 1 contentment and head out of the room into the hallway. Contentment now 13. You stand in the hall for a few moments until your eyes adapt to the lower light levels. Then you can look around and assess your surroundings. A long, narrow passage stretches before you. On either side, a little way along, is a door. Further down you can make out a flight of stairs descending to the left. Opposite the stairs is another door, while at the end of the hall, a small curtained window admits a dim illumination. All smells familiar and reassuring so far. So we've got a choice of the left-hand door, the first door on the right, the second door on the right, or heading straight downstairs. Well, I think the most important thing to do is to try and get some food. So I'm going to work on the principle that humans are most likely to be downstairs and humans are the best source of food. So that's what we will do. You lope down the carpeted steps, following their 2 little turns to the left, and find yourself in the downstairs hallway. The golden morning cascades gloriously through the coloured glass in the front door to your left, creating shimmering, shifting patterns on the shiny wooden floor. A mat rests before the door, and a small table beside it. On the other side, in a dark nook formed by the turning staircase above, mysterious objects lurk in obscurity. Opposite you, a door stands open. The room beyond smells very familiar, and you feel sure you have passed many comfortable hours there before. To your right, the hallway continues with 3 further doors opening off it to either side. You can detect faint odours of food and the outdoors from that direction. I like the way memory is being represented in this book. Cats do have a fairly good memory, but we have to assume it doesn't work quite the same way as human memory. I think there is for cats more of an element of the world being kind of remade for them anew each day, although there are definitely things that they do grasp and do recall. So we could either investigate the understairs cupboard, or we could enter the familiar room opposite, or carry on further down the hallway. Let's carry on further down the hallway. You turn to walk along the hall, claws clicking softly on the polished floorboards. There's a closed door just to your right, and 2 more doors stand open facing each other further on. When the short corridor ends, a tall, wooden, glass-faced box looms, ticking ominously. You peer briefly into its shadowed depths. A long rod swings from side to side within the case, sparking a vague recollection of past mornings. Moderately satisfied that the rod cannot escape to threaten you, you back away from the box. Do you want to go through the door on the left, which smells very faintly of the outdoors, examine the closed door more thoroughly, or head into the room on the far right, from which a slight scent of food emanates? Every choice so far has been at least 3, often more, which is really nice. Suggests there's lots of different ways of going through this book. You stroll hopefully into a large, bright, L-shaped room, following the hint of food odours in the air. Smooth, shiny boxes hum under a counter. There is a square, one-legged table with 2 stools tucked beneath it in the centre of the room, and many cupboards and shelves line the walls. Around the corner to your left is a closed door, while opposite you is the side door of the house with its tricksy flap in the bottom panel. Light floods the room from the clear upper panel of the side door and from 2 wide windows above the countertop. In a small alcove beside the door to the outside is your tray, in which you can relieve yourself if the need strikes when you are indoors. On the door's other side rest your food and water bowls. The sight of them prompts you to salivate, and your hunger is suddenly intolerable. Do you have the keyword awoken? I do not. You hasten over to your bowls, but as your nose has already warned you, the female human has not yet provided you with any delicious moist food on which to break your fast. Presumably she is still lazing in bed upstairs, the selfish creature. But if fate smiles upon you, there might yet be some crumbs of dry food left in your other bowl from last night. So we roll 1d6 to discover how many crunchy treats we find. So I roll a 2. So if you find just 1 or 2 crunchy treats, we go to the first outcome. These meagre morsels are gone in moments, achieving little more than whetting your appetite for some proper nourishment. You lap some water as well, but thirst is not your problem. You pace back and forth over the shiny tiles, your claws occasionally catching on the edges. Irritably, you sharpen them on a stool leg, then chew off a dangling claw sheath. You go up to the flap, that demonically whimsical guardian of the outdoors, and push at it more in hope than in expectation, but it does not yield to you today. Finally, you settle down grumpily to wait, staring through the scratched translucent window of the flap at the unattainable garden. Surely there has never been a more wretched and neglected cat in all the history of felinity. Awesome, yeah, that is very much the cat's mindset. Lose 2 contentment and continue. So my contentment now 11. At long last you perceive stirrings from upstairs. Doors opening and closing, a peal of laughter, coughs, a sneeze or two, thumps and crashes and the sound of running water, all the bizarre noises you have come to associate with your human's morning routine. Now comes the ponderous thudding of the female descending the stairs. Now she bustles along the hall, and now she is here, greeting you cheerfully as if she had not kept you waiting for several hours. She bends to caress your ears and rubs you under your chin in that itchy area where it is especially difficult for you to groom yourself. But will you accept her tardy blandishments? Roll 2d6. Is the result greater than or equal to your ferocity, or is it lower than your ferocity? Well, with a ferocity of 12, I think human female is getting bitten. A 2. Yes, human female is definitely getting bitten or swiped at the very least. Despite the pleasant sensation of neck caresses, your feral soul will not permit you to accept the female human's friendly overtures. Never, never can you forgive her for the dereliction of her primary duty and, indeed, the sole purpose of her existence, feeding you. You pull away and meow pointedly, nudging your bowl with your nose. She makes reassuring sounds and starts the food ritual, opening cupboards, moving containers around and clinking hard objects together. Your anticipation grows, and finally the ceremony is complete, and delicious meat fills your bowl. You eat joyfully for many minutes until the dish is licked clean. Gain 1 contentment. Contentment now 12. Now that you are fed, you are becoming aware of the birds calling and chirruping in the garden outside, and your thoughts turn to adventure. After all, when smaller fowlers maken melody, than the longen catters to seeken stronger stronze. A little bit of Middle English there. When small birds make melody, then cats long to seek strange... I don't know what stronze is, but presumably environments of some sort. You scratch meaningfully at the door, and the human female who has been fussing with some irrelevance on the countertops wanders over to do something with the flap. What's wrong with her? Doesn't she understand that she needs to open the door for you? You stare at her, baffled by her stupidity, and she bends down to push the flap ajar. She coos and pats you patronisingly, and then turns away to continue attending to her own petty concerns, letting the flap click back shut. How would you deal with this impasse? If you want to engage in a battle of wills with the female in the hopes of forcing her to open the side door, you can, or would you rather attempt to use your feline wiles to appeal to her better nature? Or, if you decide to yield to necessity and go through the hateful flap, you can do that, and if you have the keyword torty, you must take this option on her demands prompt satisfaction. Yeah, I mean, every cat fundamentally believes cat flaps to be the absolute worst way of getting in and out of a building, and they should only be used if there is no other available option. I think as a ferocious creature, I think a battle of wills with the female in the hope of forcing her to open the side door is the way to go. So we resolve the conflict. The stubborn female has a ferocity of 9. With only 3 rounds, I may as well play this out on the mic rather than doing the dum-dum-dum-da-dum. So, ferocity of 9. So she gets a 16 for her attack value. I get a 16 as well, that's a draw. She gets a 21. I get an 18. So I've lost the first round, so I need to win 2 in a row now. She gets a 17. I get a 16. I am going to test my luck to try and win that round of combat. A 3, I successfully changed the result of that, reducing my luck to 8. I should win. I've got a lot more ferocity than her. So we're at 1 each. This is the decider. She gets a 16. I should be able to win this. And I do. Hooray. With an 18. I win! As the female turns away, you start scrabbling wildly at the door, stretching up as high as your flexible body will allow towards the handle. You howl monotonously, employing the tone that you know she finds it hardest to ignore. She tries to continue with her activities on the countertop, but you can see the tension in her body. At last, with a cry of annoyance, she walks over to the door, fiddles with the handle, and flings it wide for you. Gain 1 contentment for your success. Contentment now 13. Magnanimous in victory, you press briefly against her legs before approaching the threshold. You stand half in and half out of the open doorway, checking for danger, contemplating the signs and portents, and compelling the female to wait for you to be ready. Finally, in your own good time, you step outside, and the door closes behind you. Before setting off to explore the great outdoors, you pause a moment to consider what you have already learned about the state of your territory this morning. You may have found opportunities to view the house's surroundings from windows looking in different directions during your early wanderings indoors. From how many sides of the house have you surveyed the outdoor domain today? I have done none. You stand on a gravel path running along one side of the house. Before you, herb and flower beds lie beneath a high fence made of wooden slats. To your right, the path leads towards the front garden. Leftwards, you see it continue past the corner of the building to border a large lawn. Birds call from all directions, some sounding alarms at your presence. More distantly, humans shout, children shriek, and vehicles rumble. Your sensitive nose picks up a variety of intriguing scents on the morning breeze: dewy grass, moist earth, distant human foodstuffs, small prey animals, and something rather less agreeable. Have you got the keyword torty? I have not. Would you like to start your adventures by following the path to the right towards the front garden, or head left into the back garden, or would you like to investigate the unpleasant odour? Well, my actual house does not have a front garden, so let's go there for the novelty value. As you approach the front corner of the house, you can hear an excited twittering and cheeping coming from up ahead. Your heart beats faster and your tail waves from side to side in anticipation. Would you like to rush forward straight away to see what is there, or would you rather sneak up quietly on whatever is in the front garden? I think we'll go for a little sly sneaking. Stealthily, you inch forwards, crouch down and press tight against the wall of the house. You near the front garden and perceive a host of little birds feasting and bathing on 2 bird traps erected by the local humans. One is a raised wooden platform covered with food to lure them in. The other on the right is a shallow stone dish filled with rainwater, intended to distract the prey while it drinks and washes. At least you think that is the intention. What else could these things possibly be for? However, you have yet to see any humans successfully catch a bird. The birds have not spotted you. Test your luck. I pass. My luck, however, has been reduced to a slightly worrying 7 by this point. You prepare the ambush, still unseen by any of your potential prey. But a successful hunt requires consummate skill, as well as the favourable eye of fortune. Roll 2d6 and subtract 1. Is the total less or equal to your ferocity? It is. Think I've got me a bird. Wriggling your haunches from side to side, you tense your muscles, fix your gaze implacably upon a plump pigeon atop the food table, then release yourself in a single great bound. You land upon the wooden platform amid a veritable explosion of feathers and panicked squawks, and find the pigeon's struggling body beneath your paws. One snap of your jaws at its neck and the deed is done. Your hunt has been successful. Gain 1 contentment. Contentment now 14. You tear a little at the pigeon's flesh, but you aren't really hungry so soon after breakfast, and its down sticks in your teeth annoyingly. Perhaps the human female would appreciate it as a gift. It might encourage and inspire her in her own hunting. Seized by the excellence of this idea, you jump down from the table into the surrounding shrubs, holding the pigeon's neck firmly between your teeth. Then you trot back up the side path to the door with the warm corpse dragging between your front legs and, with considerable effort, haul it through the flap into the food room. There are no humans currently present, so you deposit it under one of the stools the humans often use, where they cannot fail to notice it when they next come in. Finally, moved by your natural generosity of spirit, you rip open the body and pull out some tasty guts onto the floor to whet the human's appetite. What a thoughtful, kind-hearted creature you are. Gain one more contentment for this selfless act. Contentment now 15, and head out again towards the back garden to continue your adventures. You amble along the path, passing the rear corner of the house, and find yourself in the back garden. The path continues straight ahead into the obscure distance, bordered on its right by a long flower bed with a slatted fence rising behind it, which demarcates the edge of your territory and the start of your tortoiseshell rival's domain. A lush lawn flourishes before you, spreading out around the great central tree that dominates the scene. Small birds, which were hopping about in the tree's shade on your arrival, have taken refuge in its branches, where they call plaintively to each other. On the far side of the grass, another path's and herbaceous border completes the symmetry of the vista, under a fence of boards which hems in the territory of your other neighbours, Blackie and Ginger. After contemplating the view for a while, your attention is suddenly attracted by a flicker of movement to your left inside the house. Wandering over, you can see a human female pulling back full-length curtains behind the glass of the sliding double doors. You think she may be your local female human, but it is hard to be sure given that you can neither smell her nor hear her distinctive noises through the glass panels. They all look much the same to you, after all. You watch in morbid fascination as she finishes moving the curtains and turns to check under the large table in the middle of the room. With a gesture of annoyance, she leaves, but returns moments later carrying various bits of paraphernalia. Kneeling, she mops and pats at the floor. Is it some kind of game? What peculiar and inscrutable creatures they are. Eventually you tire of observing her pointless activity and turn to face the garden. Where will you go now? Do you want to investigate the tree, or head past the tree to check out the far end of the garden? Let's investigate the tree. One of my parents' cats when I was growing up was absolutely obsessed with people doing things, particularly my father. He would always follow him round when he was doing DIY, and in particular he had a love of following my father out to the garden when he was doing gardening. And on one unfortunate occasion, when my father was using a set of secateurs, my parents' cat, George, thought it would be a good idea to take a flying leap at my father's back without advertising his presence. And my father very nearly severed his thumb. Had to go to hospital. So, it was fine. But genuinely almost lost a thumb to his cat's sense of whimsy. The mid-morning sun filters through the stirring branches above, creating an ever-changing dance of dappled light in the dense grass beneath your paws. There is a rich, earthy smell here, as well as a hint of the disagreeable scent you noticed earlier. Round fruits from the tree lie scattered about, and occasional insects buzz around them. Do you want to sharpen your claws on the tree trunk and mark it with your scent, or play with the fruit, or carry on towards the far end of the garden at once? Let's sharpen our claws on the tree trunk and mark it with our scent. You approach the tree trunk and stretch up to your fullest extension, raking your claws satisfyingly through the gnarled bark. Then you obliterate the lingering stink in the area by thoroughly spraying the wood. Now all comers will recognise this tree as your property and yours alone. Gain one contentment. Contentment now 16. You can now either play with the fallen apples under the tree or head straight on to explore the back of the garden. was kind of hoping to be able to climb the tree, but I guess we will play with the fallen apples instead. Examining the yellowish fruits, you discover that some have been so thoroughly pecked and nibbled by small prey animals that they will not roll properly. However, you do find one new fallen which is still creditably whole and round, and bat it along the grass for several minutes with your paws. Gain 1 contentment for this amusing diversion. Contentment now 17. The whole thing with contentment broadly going up is really interesting as an alternative to the way stamina works in fighting fantasy books, where it's broadly going down. I quite like the idea of doing a game book where you play some kind of ogre or something, where the aim of the game book is just to eat as many things as possible, and your stamina just keeps increasing as you grow larger and larger. Yeah, there's something fun in that. I mean, I'll never actually get around to writing it. Too many other things to do, and it definitely wouldn't fit with the game book I'm currently working on. But it's nice to occasionally just sort of play with these ideas in your head. Anyway, we need to test our luck. 9, we are unlucky. Luck now 6. One of your wilder paw swipes sends the round fruit bouncing along the ground to collide with a well-rotted one. As you approach to continue your game, a large angry wasp buzzes up into your face. It must have been feasting on the rotten apple. You have no choice but to fight off this pesky insect. Resolve the conflict. The enraged wasp, I should say. Enraged wasp. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You should always give your monsters and combat encounters a specific name that's a bit more interesting than just whatever it is. There's nothing more disappointing than fighting an orc. There's nothing more fun than fighting a drunken orc, for example. So yeah, enraged wasp. A better choice than just wasp. It's only got a ferocity of 8, so that's cool. It gets a 16. I get an 18. I win the first round. It gets a 13. I get a 24. I win the second round as well. The wasp buzzes furiously at your face again and again, but your mighty paws are too quick for it, battering it savagely to the ground. It bounces back more feebly each time until at last it buzzes no more, lying amid the grass blades with crushed wings. You crunch it down triumphantly. Delicious. Gain 1 contentment for your victory. Contentment now 18. However, unwilling to encounter any further denizens of the fallen fruit, you move on from the tree's environs to explore the back of the garden. And I think, on that note, we will bring this recorded playthrough to an end. I think you've got a nice flavour of how a day in the life plays out. You're going to be doing a whole bunch of cat stuff. I'm really enjoying it, having a nice time. I love game books that take a specific idea and explore it as thoroughly as they can. And I think that's probably something I will be talking about in more detail, how to go about doing that, in my closing remarks, which will be coming for you in just a few seconds. Tatty bye. I hope you enjoyed that little introduction to A Day in the Life. I've played it through several times now and I've very much enjoyed it. I'm not going to review it conventionally, not least because I don't want to spoil it any more than I already have, but I am going to point out a couple of things I liked that I think are interesting and worth discussing. The first is the very low stakes. Being a cat and doing domestic cat stuff isn't a story that's going to change the world. There's no explicit mission, but Marcus has sensibly chosen to incentivise exploration through the contentment mechanic. Although it feels like stamina, in fact contentment is more like score at the end of the cat's day. There's a few different endings depending on how much contentment you've managed to accrue over your adventures. One of the issues with writing low-stakes adventures, especially open-ended adventures, is how you encourage people to actually play. Hopefully, you've written it well enough that it's enjoyable to simply explore the world, but it never hurts to put some mechanical incentives in there as well, and a score mechanic is a smart and simple way to do that. It may not matter hugely on a story level where you go and what you do, but I think there is some pleasure in trying to maximise your contentment along the journey. Stakes are important for stories. You need to have a reason to care. There's always a temptation to escalate the stakes in order to generate drama, and that's something we've seen done almost to a fault in fighting fantasy books. It seems like at any given time there's at least 30 Dark Lords trying to conquer the world of fighting fantasy. I think it would be interesting to find out what happens if they all succeeded, especially if they all succeeded at once. Presumably they'd have to fight each other for the right to actually rule in a kind of evil demon version of a wrestling battle royale. There's probably a decent story in that. But I've always personally preferred slightly smaller stories with more personal stakes because I find them easier to relate to. Someone who just wants to win a local lunatic's underground murder game show feels more real to me than someone who wants to save the world because that's what heroes do. I love that House of Hell's entire mission is basically just make it through the night. Smaller scale adventures can be really exciting. However, gamebooks, perhaps because of their roots in tabletop role-playing, have generally leaned towards external stakes and external motivations. It's very rare to find a gamebook where the central motivating aspect of the narrative is internal to this extent. One of my favourite books from the Lindenbaum Prize was A Slope of Pines by Per Jorna, which was entirely about elderly witches competing in a mushroom collecting competition. It stood out from the crowd for having a neat central hook, smart mechanics, and an absence of genuine peril. It also, much like A Day in the Life, used a score system to keep the player engaged. Small-scale stakes is something I'd like to see more of in gamebook design, but I do think it's quite hard to do well. In some ways it's a better fit for a choose-your-own-adventure style approach where discovering a bunch of different endings is the main attraction, and therefore you're free to experiment a lot more with different genres and different stakes. There's the small but interesting genre of romance-focused gamebooks, which are something I definitely need to cover at some point. The only reason I haven't covered them yet is that I feel absolutely unqualified to pass comment on popular media aimed at 12-year-old girls from the 1980s. Romance is generally low stakes in the sense that it typically only concerns a few people, but it feels high stakes because love and relationships feel especially perilous, all the more so in your teens when emotions are raw and rejection seems like the end of the world. It's not a zero-sum game either. One of the things that a lot of the best gamebooks do is play with the threat level. It's not always appropriate. Horror games in particular need to keep things feeling unrelentingly grim, but a lot of fantasy games benefit from varying tone and mood over the course of the adventure. Let's not forget Citadel of Chaos, with the whimsical leprechaun O'Shamus, who interrupts the adventure in order to play a few silly practical jokes that have no real impact on the story as a whole. That's possibly not the best example, because I would set fire to O'Shamus if I could, but there's plenty of other points in the series where things get a bit more laid back, and the fate of the world recedes from view. The second thing that's worth exploring is the way Marcus has modified familiar systems. Mechanically, this is a simple book. There's no items to find because cats don't really have hands, but there's a selection of keywords which tracks your actions, which makes sense. You aren't going to end up in a situation where your progress is gated, which ties to the low stakes element of the adventure, but the keywords do help provide a little depth as well as indicating when you've found all the important things in a particular area, which is very helpful on repeat playthroughs. The more interesting part to me is the way the book uses the classic fighting fantasy systems, but with a twist to each of them. This is something I'm a big fan of in general. I've gone on at length about my frustration with new mechanics in gamebooks. To be clear, this is coming from a place of love. I really enjoy new mechanics in gamebooks when they work. The problem is that mechanics are hard, and mechanical problems can badly dent how enjoyable a gamebook is to play. The late lamented J.H. Brennan's Fire Wolf books being perhaps the single biggest example of how poorly designed mechanics can get in the way of actually playing the game. New mechanics absolutely have their place, but I always appreciate it when a designer starts from what works, and the fighting fantasy system works. Luck here is the closest to the source material, with only the extra point of luck being included to make it different. It works well here because luck always works well. Randomly generating your luck doesn't matter too much because the stakes are so low. failing luck tests isn't going to end your adventure, and there's plenty of opportunities to get more luck along the way. A lucky cat and an unlucky cat will simply have different adventures, which is the ideal effect that a randomly generated stat should have. It'll be easier to win, quote unquote, if you've got a high luck, because you can accrue more contentment that way, but it's not actually going to stop you from getting to the end of the story. I've already mentioned that I like how contentment is both your stamina and a way of keeping score. Ferocity, similar to luck, makes a virtue of the random generation by opening up different areas for cats with either a very high or a very low ferocity. A higher ferocity is generally good, and I think if it was me, I might have considered constraining the range to the roll of a D3 rather than a D6, but it still makes use of the random generation in ways that mitigate the enormous balance problems inherent in the random generation. The fights, such as they are really interesting. I very much enjoy the best of 3 approach, where the first fighter to win 2 rounds wins the fight overall. It makes combats run much faster and gives additional weight to every roll, which is almost always a good thing. Every single round matters. This opens up a whole bunch of design space because it untethers the consequences of losing a fight from the process of losing a fight. It creates a little more conceptual work because you still have to come up with specific consequences for each fight, but you can actually just lean on losing health if nothing else seems appropriate. There is so much you could do with this system. For example, it opens up extremely difficult fights as a storytelling tool because they won't automatically end in death. And it brings out the possibility, for example, of having fights with the ultimate bad guy of a fantasy book, and those fights being extremely hard, and that being a process of selling how much of a threat the big bad actually is. In a classic fighting fantasy book, you'd have to break the core systems a bit to do the same thing, probably by running the fight only until you've lost a set amount of stamina, or until the bad guy wins 2 or 3 rounds total. And that would work, but it feels very much like what it is, which is breaking the rules to artificially keep you alive. Using the best of 3 rules, you can fight the big bad, lose, and then set the consequences to something survivable. The big bad thinks they've killed you, for example, but you do actually manage to survive. You can also use it to create uncertainty and tension. Let's say your standard outcome for losing a fight is to lose a point of stamina. You can then set the player's stamina really low, perhaps only to 2 or 3, so that losing multiple fights will put them in serious danger of death. But you can then sprinkle in fights where losing doesn't lead to any stamina loss, and fights where losing is an instant death, regardless of how many stamina points you actually have. That means that the player won't know in advance whether losing any particular fight will lead to death if they lose, will lead to stamina loss, or will lead to some other interesting consequence. It also makes regaining even a single point of stamina feel impactful. There's a huge amount of design space here for doing all kinds of cool stuff. There's a cost to it, of course. You don't get the long fights, which run really close, and you've got less opportunity for the really funny fights where some low-skill scrub somehow manages to drain most of your stamina. But I think overall, it's probably a worthwhile sacrifice. There are so many things to be gained from taking this approach to combat. These design choices are a great example of how to adapt existing systems that work and how small changes to systems can have big consequences. I strongly believe that the best mechanics are the simplest possible mechanics that are capable of capturing some experience and giving a range of possible outcomes. You can go too far with this. I think coin flips as a mechanic are generally too crude to be really interesting, but I'm a big fan of the humble D6 as a resolution tool. There's a place for new mechanics, especially if they capture something interesting, but in general, I think people are much better advised to adapt what's already out there rather than come up with things from whole cloth. And I'll talk a bit later about when it might be worthwhile to try and come up with a genuinely new mechanic. The other thing I want to touch on is how you go about designing books like this, which have a very strong central theme or gimmick. It's something we've seen several game books attempt with varying degrees of success. Freeway Fighter is a great example of a fighting fantasy book that gives players an authentic Mad Max experience, but I remember being disappointed that Seas of Blood, which had a kind of piratey theme, didn't lean into the pirate adventure premise harder. It felt like a fantasy adventure with a few low-key pirate accessories bolted on. A Day in the Life is laser focused on providing a set of experiences that will be instantly recognisable, especially to any cat owners who read it. It's a greatest hits record of feline activity. That's not the only way he could have written it. You can use the framing device of being a domestic cat to tell all kinds of stories, and you could, for example, focus on a particularly exciting or unique day in the life of a cat. There's something very pleasing to me about seeing so much classic cat stuff all in one place, and I really hope you'll feel the same way if you play it. Now, there's lots of ways of writing a game book, but if you want to really make something that hits a particular gimmick, I think you benefit from preparing quite carefully. Before you do any kind of plotting or design, I would start by making a big old list of things to include, just the most exhaustive list you can manage of all of the cliches associated with whatever gimmick you've decided on. You might also include a list of things that you want to avoid including. Let's use an example. Let's imagine that we want to do a Wild West game book and the gimmick is an Old West gunslinger. Now this immediately suggests a bunch of stuff. Quick draw duels in the sun, Mexican standoffs, horse riding, outlaws, train robberies, old mines, prospectors, dynamite fistfights, drinking, gambling, wilderness, lassos, duster coats, indigenous people, deserts, and so forth. Make a list of everything that you've ever thought was cool in a Western. And the more comprehensive, the better, because it will be a very handy guide when you come to trying to generate encounters and the overall plot. I do this before I start thinking about plot at all, because the next step for me would be looking at the big list and trying to think what kind of plot would let me hit the most set pieces from that list. Now, looking at my sample list, I think I'll want something that lets my character be fairly mobile. Revenge is a classic motivator for Western stories, so I think a character chasing down a baddie would enable them to go from place to place in a useful manner. A lone gunslinger pursuing an outlaw who'd done them wrong. This then suggests a rough structure where my protagonist will be following a bunch of clues from one place to the next, and that'll let me hit a variety of Old West settings, a train, the mountains, the prospector's mine, a ranch, a frontier town, and so forth. Now I want to look at what mechanics might support my story, and I think this is generally the right way to do it. Get your ideas, get your skeleton structure, and then think about mechanics. There's a number of candidates for what we could operationalise in this book. Some kind of fighting mechanic and some kind of shooting mechanic both seem likely. Since we're going to be travelling a lot and horses are cool, we might want a riding mechanic as well. We might also want some kind of gambling mechanic, depending on how much of a feature we want to make that. The key thing at this stage is that the mechanics you select will then further constrain the scope of the story, because whatever mechanics you do select, you're going to have to use quite a lot to justify their inclusion, and that will dictate to an extent how the book plays out in practice. If you're doing a greatest hits book, the key thing is to try and select the things that the audience will want and expect to be able to do, and which there is some degree of risk involved. I think an audience for a Wild West book is going to be expecting to have the chance to engage in some Wild West gunplay, so that's going to have to be included. Here I would look at keeping the number of core mechanics to an absolute minimum. Don't forget you can still include things that don't have core mechanics attached to them. You can do it like little bespoke minigames or whatever. In the case of this hypothetical cowboy book, I think I want to focus on gun duels. That's going to be my main mechanic. I'm therefore going to punt fistfights off to one side because one combat system is plenty. There will definitely be at least one fistfight, but we'll play it out either through choices the players make or a simple bespoke system on the page. The same thing is going to be true for horse riding, I think. I want it to feature, but I don't think it needs systemic support to underpin it. I do want a gambling mechanic, but after cogitating upon it, I come to the conclusion what I actually want is a luck mechanic which I can then build into a couple of gambling set pieces. I like the idea of using luck as a resource which the player can spend to influence various random rolls elsewhere in the text. So there's a sort of another mechanic suggesting itself that there'll be times where you'll be asked to simply roll 2 dice and the text will ask you, did you get an 8 or more? And you might have the opportunity to spend luck to influence those rolls. That's a nice, simple resource management mechanic. Resource management mechanics are almost always fun. The gunplay mechanics, however, are going to require some serious thought. Game books traditionally model guns very badly, though I have seen a few exceptions. I think I'm probably going to have to come up with something unique for this. How that process works is something we'll talk about on another episode, but it's going to need to be something fairly simple that I can replicate a bunch of times. This is going to be a gunslinger who shoots down plenty of ne'er-do-wells. And that kind of leads to another mechanical question about the finale. It's definitely going to end with a classic High Noon style gunfight. Do I want to do this with whatever gunplay system I come up with, or do I do it with bespoke decisions, or a hybrid of the two? Probably in the end a hybrid of the two. So with that, I've got the 2 systems that I'm going to be leaning on, and the feeling that there'll also be a fair number of random rolls in the course of the text, which the luck system will also have a hand in. Next step is looking at creating a rough conceptual map that includes as many of the ideas I jotted down on my list as possible. Here I'm looking at which encounters will be big set pieces that I can use to provide detailed high points in the story. These will be the focal and probably non-optional points of the adventure, so they need to be impactful and really hit the key elements of the gimmick. We already know that we're finishing on a duel at high noon. Glancing at my list, I think a train robbery will make a really exciting lead up to that. There's a lot of different things I can include in that set piece, which means it can play out in a lot of different ways, which is good for replayability. I'm also going to want a big gambling game at some point, and that'll be part of a larger saloon-based encounter. We'll probably drag in a fist fight and maybe a bit of drinking as well. Maybe we open with a horse chase to get that classic bit of riding action in early doors. Maybe following a bank robbery, another classic, with a big shootout in the streets of a frontier town for your big, exciting opener. From there, maybe we go to the hills to find a prospector's mine. Maybe from there we go down a raging river through hostile wilderness territory before heading to another larger town where the saloon action can take place. That also suggests that maybe we could have a corrupt sheriff as a short-term antagonist in either the first or the second town. I think there's a decent structure in there with just what I've laid out. In an ideal world, you always want to be struggling to fit things in rather than needing to stretch them out. From there, it's a question of filling in the map, working out where you can throw in smaller encounters to help fill out the action. A few optional areas never hurts, perhaps a paddle steamer or maybe a land dispute with some indigenous Americans. Things that would be nice to include, but which won't feel disappointing if the player doesn't get to them on a playthrough. And there you have it. You've kind of got a really nice simple structure for a game book with plenty of cool stuff in there, and one which hopefully when it's done would feel like this is a greatest hits of the Wild West. I hope that's been of some help for those budding gamebook designers out there. Like I say, there's no set way to write a game book, and other more narratively or mechanically driven stories, or stories that cross genres, will want a different approach, but I think starting with a big list of everything you might conceivably want to include is rarely a bad idea. Okay, before I go, I also need to say a thank you to a couple of patrons, Al Greer and Jim Druitt, who have separately sent me some fighting fantasy game books to make later episodes possible. I'm extremely grateful to both of you for helping support me in this way. Thank you so much. Okay, that's all for this episode. Thanks once again to my wonderful husband for writing this book and making it available to my lovely patrons. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another regular instalment of the podcast, when we'll be inching ever closer to the big 5-0 with Siege of Sardath, book 49 in the Fighting Fantasy series. I hope you'll join me for that. You can get in touch with me in the meantime by emailing me at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Until next time, thanks for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.